Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my NACL week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. We are getting dangerously close to the playoffs now. Only 3 weeks remain, including this one, and we've still got a lot to learn from a lot of these teams. The games are ramping up, they are getting more important, and teams that are near the top of the standings really need to lock in to make sure they're real title contenders, and teams near the bottom of the standings really need to figure something out quickly in order to make sure that they are not in the bottom two. So much going on in the NACL, but I'm very excited to cover it all in today's video. If you are excited as well, first of all, let me know down in the comment section below what games, what series were most interesting to you over the course of this week. What teams are really fascinating for you to watch in the NACL right now. Would love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts and my opinions on everything that's been happening in the NACL so far in the spring split, you can check out the playlist for every single week of spring up in the iCard right now. But with all that being said, without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis. Of course, if you are new to the channel, what we do here is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover. And then at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow for week number 6. I'll also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10, kind of going over where I think each team stands. And as we get closer and closer to the playoffs, that becomes infinitely more important and infinitely more interesting to talk about. So, I'm very excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. It's time to jump into the actual analysis, starting, of course, with day number 1. 2 days, 3 series each. A lot of really fun games to talk about, but the first one was definitely a bit of an upset for me. It was Wildcard Gaming taking on Cincinnati Fear, and Wildcard picking up a super crucial, super important 2-0 series win here. It really felt like they were kind of on the downturn. They started off the split so hot. They were looking so good in the first couple of weeks. A couple of their players I thought were really starting to break out as some of the more interesting prospects in the NACL. Quacker, obviously somebody who I've praised a lot on this channel, but someone like Doxa was really good. Aaron, I think, was doing really well at the beginning of the split, and things just weren't working out in the recent weeks. Their series in the last, 2 or 3 weeks had really not been all that good. They had dropped a ton of games in a row. They just were not in good form, and Fear was kind of the opposite. They have really skyrocketed up my power rankings, their only losses having been to the 2 LCS Challengers teams, FlyQuest and Team Liquid, so certainly not bad losses. A lot of their players had shown a lot of growth, and I really felt like this team was starting to come together and find their own unique playstyle, but this series kind of turned all of that on its head. Fear drops this pretty convincingly. There were moments where they looked relatively good. A couple of players I still think had relatively okay series, but Wildcard was definitely the better of these two teams. They were more proactive, and they had a clear vision of how they wanted to play. They basically won across the board, which I think is a really positive thing to say for Wildcard. But for me, player of the series in this one is going to go to Aaron in the bot lane. Mostly for that game 1 on Senna. I honestly think the Smolder game, while he was, carrying a lot of those fights in terms of damage, I think someone like Dark Wings was really like a standout. Quacker was amazing in game number 2 on the Twisted Fate, and so maybe you're not looking at game 2 where Aaron dominated in the same way. The Senna, though, in game 1 was super relevant, super important, was constantly creating a lot for Wildcard, and generally Senna is that, champion. I think the Senna plus Yasuo, obviously something we've seen this team pull out before, with Doxa having been a recently converted mid laner, and that support position is something this team feels very comfortable playing, and they play around it very well, and I think that's where Aaron was really able to capitalize on a lot of the advantages that the bot lane was able to create on their own, isolated in the 2v2, but it was really important for me to see this bot lane step up and actually win in this series. Lens and Daption weren't horrible. I don't think they played miserable in this series by any means, but Aaron and Doxa were part of the reason that this team was overperforming so much in the beginning part of the split. I thought Doxa in particular was one of the best players in the NACL through the first 3 weeks, and Aaron was certainly following up in a very, very, good way. He was making this team better, and I think being able to play off of that bot lane was really enabling Wildcard to be a little bit freer on the top side of the map, allow Quacker to play more aggressive things and actually challenge 1v1, which he hadn't been able to do in recent weeks because of the pressure he had been getting. I think Aaron and Doxa did a great job in this series to bring that back, and Aaron in particular I thought was very impressive. Like I said, also shout out to Dark Wings in the mid lane. I've been a little bit surprised by his play this year. year, not for good or for bad, just because I think it's a very different playstyle to what he has been. You know, in previous splits, in previous years, for basically every team that he's played for, he's been a bit more feast or famine as a mid laner, somebody who will either win or lose you games because of the aggressive plays that he will go for. Certainly mechanically talented enough to be able to win games and be the best player on a team at this level, but was he consistent enough? That was always the question mark from game to game. He's really been more of a supportive piece, I would say, on this team so far this year, and that's actually been a pretty big positive for them. The Hui in game number 2 was amazing. He was everywhere on the map, creating a ton of panic, went deathless in that second game, and truly felt like he was a part of every fight. He seems to have a very good grasp of that champion, and then if you're going to pull people apart with the Twisted Fate, having a Hui who can enable a Smolder, like, that's very difficult to end up dealing with. So credit to Wildcard. Quacker was good too. Winnie was also very good. I thought he was the better jungler for sure. Wildcard just felt like the early season version of them again in this series, and that's all we've been asking to see from them is getting back to that comfort zone that they had in the first couple of weeks. And then for Fear on the other side, you really would have hoped they could have at least won this series, let alone won a game. I think especially after how, I guess, excited we were last week for them. You know, they played Team Liquid hard. They beat DSG. You know, they've been on this upswing, this uptick. They've been able to beat a lot of the teams around Wildcard in the standings. I just kind of expected a bit more. Not that they were awful. I do think that they played some of these fights pretty well. Philip in particular, I thought had a pretty good series. Funny that the Renekton's coming back. You know, I still don't think that champion's particularly strong, but Philip is so good at Renekton that it doesn't really matter. He was useful, and, you know, the Aatrox game was really solid in game number 1 as well. But done of the series for me is unfortunately going to go to Chad. I feel kind of bad giving this to him because I honestly think the Talia game in game number 2 was fine, especially pairing that up with something like a Cassante in the mid lane. I thought Toasty was significantly worse in that second game, allowing Darkwings to gain a lot of prio in the mid lane and move around the map and, you know, create a lot of this havoc and panic in the mid game. But Chad was not particularly impactful in game number 1 on the Xin Zhao, and to me that was probably the least I guess good would be the word I would use there. The least good. Great grammar, Kyle. The least good game of the series for Fear. I think Chad's been actually pretty good. He's exceeded my expectations so far in 2024. You're allowed to have a couple of series where you're playing super aggro on Xin Zhao and you're just going in and the team's not following up and there's not a lot that you can do. You know, you can get away with that. I'm certainly not going to be super upset by that, especially when, you know, you have game number 2 where things are falling apart in the mid lane and then, you know, the bot lane kind of just being there. Like, Lens and Dapshin weren't bad. I actually thought Dapshin played game number 2 on the Ashe pretty okay. MF Ashe is a pretty strong bot lane, especially if you're going to try and shut down the Smolder early. There just wasn't a lot of prio coming in from the, you know, middle part of the map, and that's going to happen every once in a while, and Fear ends up dropping that. I'm not going to freak out and overreact to this loss and say that they've lost all their momentum and that they can't get it back. I just think that hopefully they can get it back sooner rather than later. You wanted to see this team continue to be on the uptick, and I think this win, or this loss, definitely kind of halted their momentum a bit. Hopefully it doesn't stall them out too much as we get to the back half of this split. And then for Wildcard, great win. You need to start picking up these wins. You were, you know, really a team that was interesting, like borderline top 5 in the first couple of weeks, and to drop to 2-4, now 3-4, I think it's a much better place to be if you can continue to win as we head into these more important series, as we head into the playoffs. I think this is a team that can cause a lot of panic, potentially be closer to top 4 than maybe we gave them credit for. They're an interesting group of players, and I think once again they showed that off in this series. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and this was a reunion of sorts for a couple of players that played together last year. It was a matchup between Supernova and Disguised, and Supernova is going to get the better of this matchup this time around. Shochi is going to win. Shochi and Faisal are going to win the pseudo-fear, I guess, breakup party reunion. I don't know how to title this. They beat Perry and Manui. They were teammates last year. You get it. You get the joke. You get the bit I'm going for. Anyways, let's actually talk about the game. That's why you're here. Supernova played really well in this. That's not particularly surprising. This team is really good. I keep trying to say and reiterate that I understand that FlyQuest and Maryville are the big 2 in the NACL right now, and trust me, we will get to that in just a bit as we get later on in this week, but Supernova has made it a clear big 3. They are one of the best teams in the NACL. Their only loss so far is to Maryville. They've looked so good in basically every series that they've played, and they are clearly a step above a lot of the other teams that are kind of trying to fight for some of those middle spots. You have to start giving them credit for having a clear play style and executing on that. I gave them a ton of credit on that last week, so really good to see that. But for DSG, it's almost the opposite. It's really interesting to see these two teams kind of paralleled against each other. because I think Supernova is a collection of very good talent that is all playing off of each other in an incredibly good way. They have a very clear way that they want to enable certain players on the team. That means some players do have to take more of a, carry back seats, like a secondary role, but they're more than willing to do that, and I think they found their niche really, really well. And then for DSG, they are also just as talented in terms of roster, but I think it's kind of been the opposite. It doesn't really feel like a lot of these players play off each other in very good ways. It feels like they haven't really identified the way that they want to play the game yet, and they're not always on the same page in terms of the calls they make. And that's how you get a series like this that ends up 2-0 in favor of Supernova. We'll talk about the good for Supernova first. Player of the series was very difficult for me in this one because a couple of players played really well. I'm going to give it to Array because he really was the one that was enabled with a lot of the resources. He was really good in game number 1 at being able to win early into that Seraphine lane, which is very important. We've seen from Fear last year that if you let Manui just kind of scale up in these Seraphine lanes, he's going to be one of the better team fighters in that role in the entire league. And, Array did a good job, I think, of shutting that down early, and then he was given a ton of resources from the Lee Sin in game number 2 on the Smolder, and he definitely made it worth it. Like, he was really good in this series. All he has to do is kind of play his role, and I think, again, that goes back to Supernova. They don't ask him to do too much. He can do a lot. Trust me, this is nothing against Array. They just don't really ask him to dominate in the same way that some other bot laners have been asked to dominate, like individually in lane. They are so good at being able to set up plays for their carries that Array just has to execute on them, and he very much did in this series. And I think a lot of that credit goes to Kenvi and Diamond, at least in this particular series. Kenvi almost certainly should be player of the series as well. It's crazy that I'm not giving it to him. He's been phenomenal. I mean, truly one of the best players in the NACL so far this year. I know he's not going to get as much talk as some of the players on Fly, some of the players on Maryville. Again, those players are great, but Kenvi has been in that same argument in terms of a most valuable prospect, at least in my eyes. He's been very good at the start of this split. The Lee Sin game was crazy. Obviously, was a little bit reckless in the mid game there on the Lee Sin, often trying to trade his life, but for the most part, it was super worth it because he was so far ahead and he was able to generate so much for his team. It was really fun to watch. Talia was also great in game number 1. Kenvi is just playing out of his mind right now. We all kind of knew that he was going to come back to the NACL and maybe get back to his old ways, being off of that, Immortals organization that seems to just doom player development, but, even I wasn't expecting it to be this quick. He's been great. Obviously, Shochi did a great job of enabling him. Love to see him back on things like the Yone. I think Yone plus Talia is an avenue, is kind of a mode for this team to go into if they need to allow Shochi to be a little bit more proactive, but for the most part, you can play through anybody on this team because they're all talented enough. Faisal was amazing as well on the top side, but Diamond is also somebody who I've praised a lot over the course of this split, and rightfully so, as a creator, as a playmaker, as somebody who's going out there and actively pushing the tempo of games by trying to, create these mid-game skirmishes. I do think that he is one of, if not the best support in the NACL right now. He really has been that good. You can put him up against, Chime for that number 1 spot, and I think Diamond is right there. Whether it was Blitzcrank, whether it was Nautilus, both of them were great. I just think Supernova's so good. Like, this team is so complete. Really, like I said last week, the only major test that they're going to run into in the regular season left is probably FlyQuest. That's the other team that I would say is on their level. Going to be interesting to see how they adapt to that matchup. But for DSG, I just don't know what to say anymore. 1-5 is such a not good start for the team that I put number 1 in my pre-split power rankings. I know I was a bit higher on them than maybe your average analyst, but I don't think anyone could have expected them to just not work in the way that they've not been working. Dead of the series for me is once again going to go to Perry. I love Perry, and I don't think this is really an indictment on his skill level. What I think we're really seeing, and again, I've said this in previous weeks, is it really just looks like he's really tilted and that he's trying to force plays and trying to make things happen, especially in that game number 2 on the Vi, where it just was like, You gotta slow things down at least a little bit. You have a Senna, you have a Hui in the bot lane. Like, you've got opportunities to kind of scale this game into the late game. You've got tools that you can team fight with. It just wasn't what you really wanted to see. And again, I think this just comes back to, I don't think these players get the best out of each other, and I don't know if that's just a stylistic issue. I don't know if it's just temporary, if they can figure something out, but it's not working in its current state. Tenacity has not been particularly good on the top side. He's been fine, but we didn't expect fine from Tenacity. We expected him to come back to pro play and be one of the better top laners in the NACL, and he's just not been that. I think this was Manui's worst series of the year. I think he would probably agree with that, and unfortunately, it feels like because of the situation surrounding this, he's kind of fallen back into some of the negative traits that he had at the beginning of last year, not in a playstyle way, but in like a mental way where it feels like he's lost a lot of that confidence that he generated so much over the course of last year. We always talked about how he was better game over game over game as that team got better, and a lot of that to me was him just trusting himself and trusting his ability to play, up and in tempo more, and it feels like a lot of that has started to go away on this losing streak. He's playing really passive and he's being targeted for it. I still think Young has been probably the best player on this team, surviving in lane. He's a good laner. There's just not a lot of opportunity to do stuff outside of lane on DSG right now. And Poom and Manui are certainly not a synergistic bot lane. They do not seem to play off each other well, at least on stage. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it's just not working for DSG. I can sum it all up in like anti-synergy. That's the best way to put it. This team just feels like it doesn't work in its current iteration. I'm not blaming anybody for that. I'm not blaming the coaching staff. I'm not blaming the players. Sometimes things just don't work out, but it's unfortunate that a preseason favorite is here at 1-5. They're in real danger of not making top 8. And then for Supernova, again, this team is amazing. They're top 3 to me at worst. It's a very clear top 3 in the NACL right now. They can play so many different styles, but they clearly have the way that they like to go to. I think Kenvi is playing out of his mind right now. Diamond is one of the best supports in the entire region, or in the entire NACL. Shochi has been great in the mid lane. His lane prio just creates so much for Supernova, and Array is like the perfect carry. Faisal just wins in the top lane. Basically, no matter who he plays into, his laning has been so consistent. And the crazy part is, like, I've talked about him so little, even though he's been so good, because everybody on this team is doing so well. Like, he just wins in the top lane, and it's like, oh yeah, Faisal won again. What else do you want me to say? Like, he's just super good at the game. It's crazy. Supernova is a very scary team, and I don't think they're getting talked about at the top of the standings enough. And that brings us to our third series of the first day here, and this was the one in week number 6 that everybody was hyped up for, a battle of the 2 undefeated teams. One will be in first by themselves after this series, Maryville University taking on FlyQuest Challengers. And FlyQuest is going to be able to pick up that win. They're going to cement themselves alone at the top of the standings for the first time, I believe, all split long. Both of these teams not only undefeated at 5-0, but same game score at 10-2 going into this series. They've been tied for first place, but FlyQuest is going to pull ahead with a strong 2-1 series win. It went 3 games, and, Maryville's legit. I think if there's anything to take away from this series, it's that this is genuinely a very good team, and I think it's very clear to me after watching these two play that these are probably the 2 best teams in the NACL, of course. I love Supernova, and I think that they could definitely make things interesting, but right now, at least until proven otherwise, FlyQuest and Maryville are just playing on a different level. I think both of these teams could operate at an LCS level pretty cleanly, especially FlyQuest. This could be like a top 4 or 5 team at the LCS level right now, in my opinion, but let's go ahead and talk about it because it's really, really fun to watch. It's everybody, right? It's all 5 of these members that really are pushing them forward and making them very dangerous to play against. I think there are a couple players that are definitely worth singling out to in particular for FlyQuest in this series. Player of the series for me is going to go to Sajed in the bot lane, mostly because it feels like he is the player of these 2 that I've given less credit over the course of this split. I've talked so much about the top side of this map, Surdy and Shaden, who have both earned it. Like, it's not like it's been unwarranted that I've talked about them endlessly at the beginning of this split. They've been 2 of the best players in the NACL. They are clearly some of the best players in their positions. It showed why they had LCS offers before the league contracted to 8 teams in the beginning of this year, but, I don't think I've given enough credit towards the bot side of this map. Sajed has really played his role incredibly well. Not always the focal point of what FlyQuest wants to do, but when they ask him to be a carry for this team, he has always stepped up, and even when the rest of this team isn't performing great, he's actually been very consistent. That Jin game in Game 1 was good. Their singular loss, he was almost certainly the best player on FlyQuest in that game, and he was given a lot of responsibility down the stretch in this series. Now, I do want to give a big shout out to Shaden in the jungle because I don't think Sajed is able to get a lot of these plays off or be nearly as successful in the latter half of this series in their wins if Shaden is not just dominating the jungle matchup, being incredibly proactive, very difficult to play into. He's having a phenomenal split, in my opinion, the best he's had definitely since leaving Cloud9, but even probably before that, right? Like, he's really good right now, and I think Sajed did benefit a lot from that, but Sajed was given a lot of responsibility, and honestly, it was the game number 1 that tipped me over the edge, even if Shaden was also relatively good in that first game. But credit to both of these guys. I've given Shaden enough credit over the course of this split. The Poppy, the Xin Zhao, even the Vi in game 1, he was looking for good plays, making a lot of active reads on the map, and I think that that's all you want to see is him being proactive, making decisions, and going for those plays because he's talented enough to be able to make those work. I've been critical of Shaden in terms of consistency in the past, but that's why I'm so impressed with what he's been able to do here on FlyQuest FlyQuest. Maybe it was Evil Geniuses that was the problem in terms of consistency, because, you know, on Cloud9, he looked like the next big breakout jungler in Academy, and now here on FlyQuest, he's kind of re-cemented his role as like the #1 jungler at this level. You know, certainly up for debate. I think Yuji on the other side of this matchup was certainly in that conversation. Kenvi is certainly in that conversation, but Shaden has been phenomenal this split and arguably the best jungler. Everybody else here was also good. Like, Chime was very good in this series, but I talk about Chime all the time. This dude is an LCS caliber support through and through, and he continues to prove that game over game at this level. Surdy has beaten everybody in the top lane, and while this wasn't one of his more, I guess, standout series, like he didn't make any flashy plays like he has in previous series, he's still winning super consistently. And while Quad got obliterated in game #1 on the Talia, and, you know, that really led towards Maryville being able to win the game through Spyrax, he was a lot better down the stretch. He was amazing in game #3 on the Nico. And so just a lot of good stuff to talk about for Fly. They're very complete as a unit, and that's why they're undefeated at #1 in the NACL. And then for Maryville, this is a good team. And I think them being able to go up and actually, you know, really compete and stay even with FlyQuest, like basically nobody else has over the course of this split, is such a positive to take away from this. I know they didn't win, but they looked pretty good in this series, specifically Spyrax in the mid lane, who I was very impressed with. Obviously, bit of a homecoming. We talked about that in the previous series with a couple of players, you know, playing against each other. Bit of a homecoming here for Yuji and Spyrax. Nobody on this team is anybody they'd be familiar with from last year, but obviously the jungle mid for FlyQuest challengers for a while in that organization, being brought up essentially from tier 3, from collegiate into that organization. You know, they move over to Maryville, and I thought Spyrax in particular played really well. He was really dominant in this series. The Hui in game #1 was sensational, truly one of the best games anybody played in this entire series, and he was still very relevant towards the back half, maybe not so much in game 3 on the TF, where Quad really stepped it up and was able to do a lot with that early game Nico prio. But, you know, I still think he was somebody that I came out of the series feeling a lot better about. Same thing with Jerry and Zyko, who are very much able to survive in laning phases. They're still good skirmishers, but Sajid and Chime were definitely better. Unfortunately, dead of the series has to go to somebody, and to me, it's going to go to Yuji. Just didn't feel like he was able to take over in the same way. We've praised a lot of the Kindred and the Graves and the Marksman jungle that we've seen, you know, not only here, but in other regions as well, specifically the LPL. And I just don't think it worked in game #2 in the Poppy game. He just lost pressure way too early and really wasn't able to catch up. I love Yuji. I think he's a very good player. Obviously was really, really in on him last year when he was on FlyQuest, and he's been great at the start of this split for Maryville. One of the big reasons they've been able to overperform is their, you know, willingness to start him. But, you know, I thought Shaden was just strictly better, especially down the stretch in this series. So, you know, worth pointing that out. But again, it's almost picking at straws because you're going against the best team, and honestly, you did play relatively well. You kept this series close, and you made it very interesting, which I just don't think a lot of teams have been able to do against FlyQuest. I'm still very high on Maryville. These are the top 2 teams in the league. And then for Fly, you know, we can talk about how these are the top 2 teams, but they are the top 1 team. I said it, you know, earlier. I'll say it again here. This is an LCS caliber team. They could be, I think, a top 4 to 5 team in the LCS if everything went right with this collection of players. That's where they're at right now. That is the level that they are playing at. Their macro's great. Their individual mechanics are really good, and they're very consistent. I really don't see a lot of avenues for this team to lose in major situations. They've got to be the favorite to take the title home with the current state. And now moving on to day #2 in the second half of the week here in NACL, week #6, and we've got a surprisingly, like, below 500 clash between these teams. Team Liquid Challengers taking on Mirage Alliance, and Team Liquid is going to be able to pick up the 2-1 series win. Mirage definitely put up a fight. The series was very, very close. Honestly, all 3 games definitely had some interesting parts of it, specifically games 1 and 2, which I think were back and forth basically for the entirety of the game. But Team Liquid is going to be the team that makes the most out of their opportunities, and they're going to come out on top. Unfortunately for Mirage, they're going to move to 1-6. I think they have been pretty clearly the worst team in the league, at least in terms of performances at the start of the year, but they have been playing a lot better as of late. The first couple of weeks where they went winless were definitely not very good, but it seems like they're starting to figure out some individual priorities that they can play through, and they've been better because of it. But Team Liquid is a team that is technically a bit on the rise at the current moment in terms of what they've been able to do. You know, that win over Fear last week was very big, and now another win here against Mirage. It's not been a very good start to the year in terms of winning streaks for Team Liquid, so it's nice to see. Player of the series for me, pretty obviously, is going to go to Keel in the jungle. Awesome stuff from Keel. I've been a little bit, I don't want to say disappointed, but underwhelmed by what Keel has been able to do at the beginning part of this split. He was such a major factor for Wildcard last year, and honestly for the league as a whole in terms of the way that the meta ended up developing, that, I just expected him to go to a bigger organization here with really talented players around him and be able to make it work, be that star in the jungle that he was for a lot of sections of last year, but he's kind of moved away from a lot of the pocket picks that he was playing a lot last year. Obviously, we saw the Zac in this series. That's something he has played a lot over the course of his career, but things like Nunu and Karthus, they have not appeared at all so far in 2024, and I think that's almost limiting what his options are. I know they're, out of meta, not necessarily super strong at this level, but it's still Keel. Like, let him do the things that he's good at, and I think you're going to win a lot more, but he was very good in this series. This is probably the best series that he has played so far for Team Liquid, at least in my opinion. Will is a very good jungler and definitely tried to do a bit too much in game number 3, but Keel did a great job of taking advantage of that. The Belveth in game number 2, really, really good stuff, and then the Vi in game 3. He was game-breaking on the Vi, which is really good to see, because Vi is such a almost meta-proof jungler in her current state. She does so many things at a very high level that even when her numbers are a little bit lower than the other junglers around her, like they kind of are at the moment, she's still going to be one of the highest prioritized junglers in the entire game. So credit to Keel, really like how he played. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep this up. Loved what Spawn and Kimdown were able to do. One of their more complete series, I would say, is the bot lane. Kimdown, I think, has struggled to adapt to playing with Spawn in particular, who is not necessarily as aggressive in the early laning phase. Somebody who does want to play a bit more for the late game team fighting, does kind of fall into that Patrick or Teddy kind of mold of player where isn't really going to create his own advantages in the same way. And I think Kimdown got very used to playing with someone like Arrow last year, who was going to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of how he played the isolated 2v2s, but this was the first series where it felt like, it's starting to figure itself out. I thought Spawn in particular was really good in the back half of these games, especially on the Senna, where they really needed him in game number 2. And then Jenkins. I think Jenkins has been so much better over the second half of the split. Was concerned about him because he wasn't great on CLG, or at least wasn't perfect on CLG the last time he was in Academy or the NACL. And then he was coming over here and asked to play a pretty big role for a team that was expected to finish near the top of the standings. I just wasn't sure what we were going to get out of him. And at the beginning of the split, it kind of was that, a very up and down, very inconsistent run from him. But Warwick in game 3 was a lot of fun. Rumble was really solid in game 2. I think Roamer's really starting to find his footing. I think Team Liquid is starting to get better. I don't think they're one of the best teams in the league. I think top 3 very much has established itself, and Team Liquid just doesn't feel like they're on the same level, even in their wins just yet, but they have the talent to be able to get there relatively easily, so hopefully they're going to continue to improve like it feels like they are right now. And then for Mirage on the other side of this, they're just not great. Like, they are... It's good to see them compete with Team Liquid, and like I said, games 1 and 2 were very competitive. This was not a blowout series by any means. This was not a series where Team Liquid was clearly the better team across the entirety of it. Both games 1 and 2 were very fun, and Mirage was actually able to pull out a win in game number 1, which I did not think they were going to be able to get. A lot of that off the back of Will and Prismal playing really well, and I think Dardoch had a couple of good engages on the Alistair. There were moments in game 1 and game 2 I thought was also pretty positive. RJS had a much better performance in game number 2, but it just wasn't enough to be able to push them over the top. And then unfortunately game 3, the Lee Sin just lost so much prio in the early game. It was a pretty bad game from Will, and he's going to get done of the series for it. I like Will a lot. He's been the player that I think has been the most willing to go out there and try to make plays for Mirage, a team that looked very, passive for a lot of the beginning part of this split. Alorum was pretty passive on the top side, still is, but Prismal and Dardoch were really not working on the bot side, and RJS, he was mechanically playing well, doing well in lane, but wasn't creating these same advantages. Will was the one that was kind of pushing the tempo for Mirage, and, at times he was looking bad because of it, but for the most part, it was a positive trade-off, and unfortunately, it just feels like sometimes that continues to be a problem, is that he's on separate pages from the rest of his team, a team that wants to play a little bit slower. Will is not the kind of jungler who wants to play slow, and the Lee Sin, I think, definitely suffered for that in game 3, but generally, I think Mirage does look a lot better right now than they did at the beginning of the split and the season, where they just did not look good at all. This is not a team that I would say is like guaranteed 10th in the NACL. Obviously their schedule is not particularly easy, and they're going to have a lot of challenges, but, if this team went on a winning streak to get to, 8th place, I'm really not going to be entirely surprised. There are a lot of teams with bad records, and, the middle of the pack in the NACL is so clumped up right now that I think it's reasonable to say that Mirage could be, a top 8 team. I just don't know if I'm predicting that. They've been number 10 all split long, and, this is just another loss, even if it was a close one. And then for Team Liquid, this is a good team. I'm just kind of waiting for that opportunity for them to show that they are a great team, which they just haven't done for me yet, at least over a consistent amount of time. This feels like a solid solid team, but not one that's going to be competing for the title. And that's an unfortunate thing to say. Hopefully they can continue to build on some of the wins they've gotten recently, but I'm still not entirely enthused about what TL has offered in 2024. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and a top versus bottom team matchup that went as expected. It was FlyQuest Challengers taking on AOE Esports, and FlyQuest is going to be able to dominate their way to a 2-0 series win here. AOE, not exactly the worst team in the league, I want to make that clear. I actually really like where this team was at last week, and that's why I moved them all the way up to number 7 in my power rankings, but FlyQuest is just on a different level from the other teams in the NACL at the moment. We saw that earlier this week when they were able to dispatch of the undefeated Maryville. Now we see it when they play a team that unfortunately just isn't on the same level. Like, this is an LCS caliber team, and AOE has a couple good prospects and has a lot of interesting pieces, but they're just not going to be able to get the job done in a series like this. I probably won't spend too long talking about it because honestly, there just isn't a lot of analysis to give you. This is FlyQuest outplaying them, being mechanically better, being better in terms of the mid game and closing out, games very quickly, very cleanly. It's great stuff from FlyQuest, but I can't really blame AOE from losing in the way that they did. But let's talk about it. Player of the series, anyone. I mean, truly anyone on FlyQuest. Everybody won super hard in this series. Again, very much wanted to give this to Shaden in the jungle, who I thought was crazy consistent across this series. Quad obliterated game number 2 on the Orianna. One of the best Orianna games I've seen in a long time. I mean, the dude was just everywhere on the map destroying things, but I'm going to give player of the series to Surdy. I mean, he played Darius in game number 1 and just poor Zamudo. I mean, there really wasn't a ton he could do here. The Darius was so dominant in that first game. He was still very strong on the Renekton in game number 2, but I felt like everybody won a bit more in game number 2, where it was just like, oh, you get a win, and you win lane, and you win lane, and it's just kind of everywhere across the board, right? I think Surdy was more of the carry in game number 1, and that's why he's going to get the player of the series for me. I think a strong argument to be made right now that Surdy is the most valuable prospect in the NACL. This guy is just destroying everybody that he is going into. FlyQuest is dominating games, and to me, he's been the best player on this team, and I'm really happy to be able to say that, but again, it's such a team effort because it's not like Shaden played bad. He went deathless across this entire series on Wukong and Sejuani, 2 champions that are going to be going in, that are going to be putting themselves in danger. He was super high up on the KP percentage charts and was dominating these games. Like I said, Quad had one of the better Orianna games in game 2 that I've seen in a very long time. It was very good stuff. It's not like Sajed and Chime lost at all. They were both very relevant. It's just so many players on this team are overperforming expectations, are dominating in their individual matchups that it's just hard to point out all of them as winning all the time. They're all winning, and that's the crazy part about FlyQuest. It's what makes them so dangerous. But for AOE on the other side of this, they just weren't good enough to be able to compete. Top side of this map really just wasn't strong enough in their current state. Zamudo is going to get done of the series. He went 0-12-1 across 2 games. Not particularly good, and, it's going to happen. You're going to have bad series every once in a while, but I don't think Zamudo has had a particularly good split up until this point. I know a lot of people are very excited about him, and his mechanical ceiling is certainly there, but the consistency has yet to prove itself over the 2 years that he's been here in Tier 2 in North America. This series did not help in terms of that opinion that I have generated, but it's not like Rosethorn and Onat were better. I'm as much a part of the O Nation as anybody else, but Quad was unbelievable in game number 2, and the Hue just really was never going to be able to get off the ground. Not a particularly good series from him. Rosethorn got out-jungled into oblivion. He played a couple of carries and just never had any prio, never had any pressure, was never actually able to make any plays, and that's not great. I mean, Wixie and Breezy didn't really lose all that hard, but what are they supposed to do in this matchup when topside is losing as hard as they are? When you hit 10 to 12 minutes in the game's over in game number 2, there's really just not a lot to do here for AOE. You have to chalk this one up to, we lost, we were outplayed, we were outskilled, it's FlyQuest, and they've beaten everybody, they've destroyed everybody. I'm not going to freak out about this. I would have loved to see AOE be a bit more competitive in this series, but FlyQuest has had a point to prove for a little while now, and I don't think you can blame that on the losing team here in this one. FlyQuest is really just that good, and until proven otherwise, they're going to be considered the number 1 team in the NACL. Like I said earlier, the favorites to win the NACL title this split, and, for an organization that has constantly put so much emphasis on development on Tier 2, even before, someone like Papa Smithy, who's notorious for his development love, came into this organization. This was always an org that wanted to try and prioritize young players and bringing in, faces that could be big for the LCS in the future. And I think they've done that with a squad of 5 players that I think all are going to get LCS looks even in the mid-year. And that's going to bring us to our third series of day number 2 and our final series of the week here in week number 6. And not to be outdone, Maryville came out and showed that they are on the level of FlyQuest. It was Maryville taking on Lit Esports, and what a destruction of a series. Game 1 was a pretty standard beatdown. It was, pretty standard that Maryville was just kind of the better team, and they went out there and won, very similar to what we saw out of FlyQuest in the first 2 games in their series against AOE, but game number 2 was something different, man. 22 minutes, 41 kills for Maryville. Okay, yeah, all right. It's crazy. This was a wild game to watch. Very, very crazy coming in from them. Lit stood no chance. I mean, Maryville was pissed off after their loss to FlyQuest earlier in the week, and they made it their mission to come out in this one and to absolutely dominate, and that's exactly what they did. Player of the series, take your freaking pick, man. Spyrex was so good in game number 1 on the Tristana. Yuji was so consistent across this whole series. Niles was definitely the better top laner, but I'm going to give it to Jerry. Him and Zyko were amazing in the support and bot lane, respectively. They dominated their opposition here. Rockboom, tried his best to create some plays, but in doing so, stepped up a little bit too much on the Kai'Sa, and man, Scary Jerry was willing to take advantage of that. First of all, crazy good Kalista game in game number 1, was very good in lane, and the mid-game prio that he was able to generate caused them to skirmish a lot and really snowball the game out of control. It was big stuff coming in from him and Spyrex, who I thought demolished game number 1. And then game number 2, the Varus was incredible. Yeah, he was a little bit more susceptible to some aggressive plays, maybe because he was looking so eagerly at some of these big engages, but man, he was really, really solid, and Jerry has very much emerged as one of the most talented AD carries in the NACL. We were kind of talking about that at the beginning of 2023 as maybe the expectation for him. I was always a big fan of Jerry and Zyko in Collegiate, and I thought that they were going to translate well. Didn't necessarily work in year 1, but man, is it working out here in year 2, where they have become maybe the best bot lane in the NACL. Like, it truly is up for debate. They've been that good. But Yuji was amazing. Not least in game in game 2, I mean, everywhere. Truly just game-breaking. I know I use that term a lot, but I really mean it in this context. He broke the game with how good he was on that Lee Sin. Very, very fun stuff. Like I said, Spyrex was great. Zyko was very good. Niles was winning on the top side. Maryville very much had a point to prove in this one, and they proved their point, that they still are a team that deserves to be near the top of the power rankings, that you shouldn't take them lightly just because they lost to FlyQuest in a very close series. They are still one of the best teams in the NACL. Here is your proof. And then for Lit on the other side, unfortunately, they were the victims of that mentality for Maryville. They're an okay team. Again, we talk about a lot of these teams near the middle or the lower part of the standings as having interesting qualities, but having not been able to put it together for extended periods of time. That's really where I am with Lit right now, is just they're not consistent enough, and unfortunately, the best teams in the league are going to be able to take advantage of them like they did here. This was not a particularly good series for anybody. I think Messages is the one who continues to make the least amount of game-losing errors, and I think Dragoon has been interesting on the top side, but, Rockboom had a couple of really good moments and a couple of really bad moments in this series, a little bit of both, and then Kisno and Plux were just kind of run over in their respective matchups. I almost gave Dud of the series to Kisno because he was really not good. He could not keep up with Yuji, and especially in that game 2 where the Lee Sin really just took over, started running around the map and just doing whatever he wanted. There was nothing you could do in the jungle to stop it, but I'm going to give it to Plux. Again, sometimes when you play these engagers, when you play Tahm Kench, when you play Nautilus, you're going to maybe look a little bit worse in losing matchups, but it was not a good series for Plux, and generally what we've seen from Plux as a player, at least at this level, not only this year, but last year as well, is that when he wins, he looks really good, and when, he's in control, and when he gets to play from ahead, he can actually be a really solid game controller and really start to, wear the tempo down, but sometimes when he has to play from disadvantageous positions, play from gold deficits, he's a little bit too risky and can sometimes put his team in negative situations. That's not always going to be a bad thing, but this was not a great series from Plux. A lot of the engages, specifically in game 2 on the Nautilus, were just a little rich, and they definitely lost lane in game number 1 with the TK, and so not a lot of great stuff, but again, Plux, I think, has very much defined himself as a player at this level, and that's not a bad thing. As long as he can continue to grow and get that consistency up, I'm going to be a little bit more positive. He's shown a lot of good traits. It just wasn't a good series. Same thing for basically everybody else here, Kisno or Messages or Rockboom or Dragoon. It's just a rough series here for Lit. He gave up 41 kills in 22 minutes to Maryville. It's just not what you would have wanted to see, but again, Maryville came to destroy, they came to play in this one, and unfortunately, you were just kind of the recipients of that. Maryville is definitely the talk of this series, and they deserve to be. This team is scary. They play with a lot of ferocity and fire, and I think these players' mechanics are really shining through. In 2024, this is still one of the best teams in the NACL, despite the loss earlier in the week. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 6 overview and analysis video. Of course, up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings in the NACL after 6 weeks of action. We've got no ties, at least at this point in terms of game score, so you see number 1 to number 10. You just don't want to be in the bottom 2. Of course, also on the screen, on the right hand of all of these team cards, you're going to see 3 things. First of all, power ranking. That's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. Change, how that has changed from last week to this week, and of course, the streak that they are currently on. We can go over risers and fallers in terms of my personal power rankings, but really almost nothing to talk about this week. There really weren't a lot of upsets. Wildcard beating Fear was definitely a bit surprising for me, but Wildcard has been so inconsistent that I'm hesitant to move them up into the top 6 in terms of, proving it. I think DSG has lost to a lot of good teams recently. I need to see them lose to the less than stellar teams over the next couple of weeks. They do not have a rough end of the year. They have a lot of, lower, standings teams to close out 2024 spring. If they can pick up wins there, they should be a team that, is reasonably somewhere near the top 6, but I just don't want to put them down until they prove that they're losing to the teams that are below them in the standings. And then, obviously, for Wildcard, they are going to move up at least 1 to number 7. AOE is going to drop down to 8 because of that awful loss, but those two teams are still very similar in my eyes, both very interesting, but very inconsistent. Hopefully, they can pick up some of that consistency down the stretch, but nothing else changed. I mean, maybe you can move Fear down because of the upset loss, but I felt so good about them last week that I don't necessarily want to do that. I certainly don't think I feel comfortable putting anybody below them at, in the top 5 at the current moment, at least more so than them. And outside of that, there really wasn't any reason to make any changes. Maryville very much clearly looks like the second best team in the league still, and top 3 very much isn't changing. So let me know if you would have made changes to the power rankings down in the comment section below. I'm definitely being a bit more hesitant, but I would love to know your thoughts and opinions down there. So without further ado, it's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 6 here. Pretty easy choice for player of the week for me. It's going to go to Shaden, the jungler for FlyQuest Challengers. I mean, FlyC was dominant this week. They took down their biggest rival in terms of second place Maryville, and they obliterated AOE in their matchup, and Shaden was a big part of both of those series. He has been fantastic so far in 2024. If he can keep that up, FlyQuest is going to be the favorites to win the league. Basically, no question. Runners up, my honorable mentions, Array, the bot laner for Supernova. They looked great in their series earlier in the week against DSG, and I think bot lane was a big part of that. Array being so good at being able to play with resources and being able to capitalize on the advantages that his team was able to create was big for Supernova. And then Sajed, another FlyQuest player who was awesome this week. Probably the best week that he had in the NACL in terms of carrying games. He's always been a really good secondary piece, especially alongside how good this top lane has been, or this top side in particular has been, but he really got to put on a bit more of a carry show in that Maryville series, and I think that that was a big takeaway for me. So Array and Sajed as runners-up, honorable mentions, but Shaden is going to get my player of the week, and then dud of the week, unfortunately for me, is going to go to Zamudo, the top laner for AOE. Just a brutal series. Surdy came with something to prove in that series, and 0-12-1, I think, does sum up, the little impact that Zamudo had. No lane pressure, no outside of lane pressure. Again, it wasn't just him. AOE struggled and Lit struggled very similarly in their series against Maryville, but it is what it is. Sometimes you're going to have good series and sometimes you're going to have bad series, and in AOE's one series this week, Zamudo was not particularly good, so he's going to get saddled with dud of the week in week number 6, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below, and leave a like on this video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only cover the NACL on this channel, we cover all 4 of the major regions as well, so LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL, every single week that they play. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.